Hello, I'm Dustin Wunderlich, Director of Marketing and Communications for the University of Washington College of Education, and I'm here today with Tom Halverson, Director of the Masters in Education Policy program here at the University of Washington. We're going to be talking about Tom's essay in the most recent edition of Research That Matters magazine on the need to create alternative pathways for more high school students. So if you have questions during today's chat, please send them in and we'll work them into the conversation here. So Tom, to start out with, can you tell us a little bit about what you see as the problem with encouraging every high school student to pursue a college degree?
Sure. Do I need to offer a disclaimer up front,
Sure.
Dustin, that
Yes.
these opinions are mine alone and don't represent the viewpoints of the University of Washington or the College of Education? So I can speak, and I also want to offer a caveat that I don't consider myself an expert in this area, but I have some semi-well-informed opinions, I think, about this. So, and this is one of the areas in which I do. And I think conceptually that notion is a really good one. I think aspirationally that's a good thing for us as a society to sort of shoot for. But I think when we say we want college for everyone, what that ends up doing in sort of a unfortunate way is supporting and perpetuating and legitimating the current existing system that we have that really doesn't do a particularly outstanding job of equitably distributing opportunities out there. And so I think as well-intentioned as people are, and I know that it feels like the right thing to say, we want to be for that, but I think when we do that without going beyond that, and we just make that the rally cry, it essentially just continues to put momentum behind the system we have now that's essentially supporting a minority of students getting through and getting a post-secondary degree and a majority of students not.
Mm-hmm. And so how did we get to this point where we have such an emphasis on college prep for all students?
I think it's happened for all sorts of reasons, and it's a complicated question. I think there are some economic reasons. I think there are some social reasons. But I think a couple of factors that maybe don't get as much attention as they should. One of those is parents. I'm a parent. I'm part of this. I'm pointing a finger at myself. But I think there's a lot of pressure that's put on parents these days to try and do what they think is best for their kids. And so they put a lot of pressure on school districts, on high schools to provide an opportunity, a vehicle through which their son or daughter can get a competitive advantage in the college admissions marketplace. And I think that's driven a lot of the curricular decisions that high schools have made over the last couple of decades. And as a result of that, a lot of things that used to be a part of high school curriculum are no longer there, and we've replaced those with more and more and more college prep sorts of things to try and add that competitive advantage for that high school. Seems to be the metric as to how, in addition to graduation rates, how high schools are judging themselves, what sort of a value they put on their part of the school system. So I think that's a piece. I think we let old vocational programs do some things that were not particularly productive. I think old VOTEC tended to sort people in ways that was really unfortunate, and I think people saw that, and so it was easy to, rather than to try to change that, it was easier to just sort of jettison those and get rid of them and make them the enemy. And then I also think, pointing a lot of fingers at myself here, Dustin, but I think higher education also played a part in this in terms of marketing themselves as the way to get ahead. And while that's true in some senses, it's equally not true in other senses, in that I think more and more these days it does less and less of what we think it does for students as they get out into the marketplace. A lot of what employers are looking for these days are not the things that higher education, a bachelor's degree, does for you. Soft skills, those sorts of things. Employers, I was on a task force last summer where we looked at some of these challenges in higher education in terms of how to adapt, how to try and better meet the incoming students who are now going through college and high school and all sorts of different than the traditional pathway through. And one of the things we heard from employers was that they were wanting students to have a basic fundamental academic preparation. They wanted them to be prepared to be able to do the basic sort of writing and thinking that you would believe a person would get out of a college degree, but they also were very interested in people being able to work in groups and both lead a group and work as a follower in a group. And one of the things we discovered is that that's not really a big part of what we do or what we focus on here in higher education, and that's a direction that we needed to consider and address and move forward in. So again, I think how we got here, back to your original question, sorry I was on a little bit of a walk there, how we got there is I think there's been more and more pressure to increase competitiveness for students, so high schools have opted to try and add more and more college prep sorts of classes. And then I think we've seen more marketing and more interest in promoting college as a vehicle through which you can reach your professional goals.
Mm-hmm. And certainly higher education, four-year colleges, the cost has increased over the last few decades, and there's been a lot of attention to the rising cost of four-year college of education. So there's a need to justify that too, probably, in talking about the economic payoffs of a four-year degree.
Right. Mm-hmm. And the interesting part about that too, I think, is I think it's less true because I think the advantage of getting a college degree is less true in terms of providing those things that are going to make you successful at work. I think they're less true today than they may have been in years past. But what's more true is that it's increasingly becoming a signal in our society that you have achieved something and that you therefore are a learned person. Mm-hmm. So it's almost as if it were a signal to employers and to people in our community that that's the thing, that a college degree is that thing that's going to set you apart from other people. But increasingly, with more and more people getting college degrees, it's becoming less and less of a factor that differentiates people.
Mm-hmm. So now, what's your recommendation for how we can start to change our current system of secondary education to better serve all students and do so in a more equitable fashion?
I'm not particularly bullish. I'll be honest with you. I'm not particularly bullish on the way the angle to go is working through via the traditional public education system. There was a really interesting article not too long ago. Nick Hanauer wrote an article in The Atlantic about, he sort of explored the investment we've made in school reform, education reform, and the benefits that we've made as a result of that, and being reasonably discouraged about that. And I thought he made some interesting points. And I think especially when we're talking about college being that way for students to get ahead, to make a difference in their future earnability, I think we see that that there's less hope, I think, in the part of investing in the traditional pathway or partnering with schools. I think I'm more bullish on thinking about partnerships outside. Georgia Hayward at the Center for Reinventing Public Education, she's a researcher there and has done some really interesting work recently where they've looked at a number of different programs and sort of trying to better understand what new CTE, career technical education, is. And we're starting to see they're looking or have sort of focused on three central areas: traditional paths with public schools, partnerships, community partnerships with charter schools, and then advocacy organizations out there that seem not to have anything to do with the schools. And it's going to be interesting to see where that work goes in terms of finding out if there is a model, if there is a pathway that shows more promise than others. And I don't mean to beat up on public schools too much, but they do kind of have a history of not being particularly aggressive towards wanting to change, wanting to change what they've done throughout history. And so I think I'm encouraged to see those models that don't rely on just trying to add a few things to the existing college prep curriculum in the hopes that we'll be able to catch a few more folks that are in the system. I'm been in this a long time. I clearly am getting increasingly cynical about it, I guess. And I'm interested more in trying to think outside of that structure and think about ways that we can develop systems that might provide more opportunities and more pathways for students and families to be able to go in directions that aren't reliant on the existing system. Because we've seen an awful lot of examples where we'll change the traditional public school system a little bit. Comprehensive to small schools, back to comprehensive again is a great example of this. I think it's pretty often that we'll see the school system just revert back to the mean after a few years or after a new crisis comes up. And I think we need to think about this in a completely different way.
Mm-hmm. So there has been a lot of talk about apprenticeships recently.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that part of that is developing new partnerships with unions or businesses to try and develop some of those pathways to make apprenticeships easier for students to pursue and make that sort of transition from school into a trade or career?
Absolutely. I think that's a big part of it, and I think we need to destigmatize a lot of that piece. I think an awful lot of that currently is seen as a lesser than option, and I really think that's something that we need to identify, address, and overcome, because it certainly is not. And if you look at the economic projections, that's a big part of where our economy's projected to go in the future is infrastructure. I mean, you hear about it all the time, and a lot of those are construction and transportation jobs, and in those fields, they're having an increasingly difficult time finding folks to fill those apprenticeships. And those are great jobs and provide a really useful and productive way to contribute to our society. Family wage jobs, great benefits, good retirement, those sorts of things. So I think that's a great way to go. As I said in the article too, I think, and we're even seeing a recent Democratic presidential candidate talk about this a little bit, which I was floored by, almost fell over in the back of my chair. But I think, he mentioned that we need to think about valuing students that choose not to go to college as well. And while I think that for most students there is going to be some benefit to post-secondary education, I think we need to, again, destigmatize. When we say college, we almost always mean a 4-year institution. And there's an awful lot of evidence these days that suggests that training programs and certification programs are a really smart way for lots of students to go, and are starting to show really interesting things in terms of the data around their earning potential over the long haul. And so valuing those and not trying to limit those options and opportunities for all students, regardless of your socioeconomic status or anything else, how far your parents went in school, those sorts of things. So that's where I think we need to go with those sorts of things, Dustin, is that I think we really need to set aside our traditional notions about those. And that's why, again, and I don't mean to continue to beat up the public school system, but that's, again, why I'm very, see if I can put this in a positive spin. That's why I'm encouraged by looking at partnerships outside the traditional school system to think about breaking away from what has historically been a very difficult system to change and shift, and encouraged to move in a direction that would value those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. So, are there some good models for this type of, cutting edge or innovative career and technical education that you've talked about that we could learn from?
I think so, and we're really fortunate in Washington State. We just passed I'm going to forget the name of it. Washington Workforce Education Investment Act. Way to go, Washington State Legislature, for passing that, because that does a great deal to move us in that direction as a state. And really, as a state across the country, we're one of the leading legislatures to promote this sort of thing. Governor's behind it. Good for you, Governor Inslee. I think we're really starting to lead that movement in terms of thinking about redefining what career and technical education is and thinking about it in a different way. And I think the legislature's move to support that is going to begin to shift parents. Remember, I talked about parents being a part of the challenge in terms of, I think we need to re-educate folks in terms of thinking about what is a good option, other than just immediately having your son or daughter go into a four-year institution, and that's really the only pathway. There are now starting to be programs that are being designed and built that will create multiple pathways that may eventually lead to a post-secondary degree, but don't necessarily have to lead immediately to a post-secondary degree. And so I think in our state, I think we're doing some really great things. That just happened this last legislative session, so I'm really encouraged and really excited to see what happens. And then, as I mentioned, that work at the Center for Reinventing Public Education that Georgia Hayward is leading, that's a study that is now starting to explore a number of, I'm going to get the number wrong, but I think I remember reading it was 32 different programs they're going to look at in those three different categories. And I'm going to be really excited to follow that work and see what they find out in terms of what seems to show promise and what seems to show less promise, and help that guide where we want to go. But the other piece that, I guess this is my chance to rev up the troops, the other piece that I've got some friends in the business community as well, and I'm going to really encourage those folks to be brave and be bold and to try and think in a innovative and entrepreneurial way that may not include the traditional pathways of putting pressure on the public school systems to change, but how can we think about ways of creating systems and opportunities? And I know they are already, and a lot of those are great, but continue to move in that direction, to not wait for the schools to change, but to be that leading light that drags schools along with them.
Mm-hmm. I mean, to what extent do you think this involves rethinking about sort of the whole trajectory of education? I mean, right now, kind of K-12 education, 4-year degree, but there's also a lot of conversation about jobs are changing rapidly, the different skills that are necessary. Is there a part of it that we need to rethink beyond just, hey, you're doing education, from the time you're, in kindergarten to the time you're 18, and then you're out of the system, or the time you're 22 and then you're graduated from college? Is more of like thinking about a lifelong support for education, so that folks can continually refresh their skills?
Yeah. Yes, very much so. And I think that's why in the article I'm a big advocate of trying to disassemble this notion that it's this very linear, iterative pathway that you go from high school to a 4-year degree to your career to you retire. That what we need to think about, because in the United States we have one of the most sort of permeable higher education systems, unlike other places in the world where if you don't get in right out of high school, that's pretty much it. You're locked out. But here, you can re-enter college at just about any point in your career, any point in your life. And so I'm a big fan of thinking about creating pathways that are more, and I know this is going to sound kind of cliche, but brace yourself, but that are more student-led. That I think one of the big reasons why lots of kids end up not feeling successful and dropping out after their freshman year of college is because it wasn't the right time for them. It wasn't the right time for them academically, wasn't the right time for them psychologically, wasn't the right time for them financially. If there were pathways where you could, in high school, begin a career pathway that you may or may not want to stay on for the rest of your life, but created an opportunity for you to make a livable wage while you were a student, and you decided to pursue a certificate, and that certificate led to a different position or a better position at your current job, and then that led you to be interested in, well, I want to get more education around this so that I can do this thing. If that were a more attractive, more viable, a better supported pathway for kids, I think we'd see a lot more people complete a college education. And interestingly enough, I'm not going to get this statistic right, but I'm sure there's somebody out in the ether there that will correct me. But I think I remember a statistic that said that kids that go through CTE programs and take CTE classes in high school have a 93% graduation rate from high school versus the traditional 76%. So that notion of you getting engaged and finding a practical use for a lot of the things that kids get bombarded with in high school these days, I think seems to be a really useful strategy for trying to get them and keep them engaged. The other beneficial piece of getting them involved in CTE that includes connection to work and a workplace environment is that kids learn how to be in a work environment. Kids learn how to, they're hopefully in a situation where positive group work, positive teamwork, leadership is modeled for them in ways in which when they finally get a degree, they're actually able to go out and use that and put that into practice with a lot of these other skills that are going to be really useful. Versus, I went through high school, I took all AP classes, I got into the college I want, I got my degree in the classics, and now I'm a barista at Starbucks. I think there's a lot that makes sense about thinking about trying to introduce those sorts of elements into a student's life before they get into the workaday world. And we're starting to find that, coincidentally, in the MEP program, in the Master's in Education Policy program. When I began that program, we waited almost until the end to try and introduce some of those pieces to students about how these things that you're learning in the program are going to impact this job that you might be interested in, or that job, or let's bring this person in and have them talk about their career, but let's not do that until you're through spring quarter. Now we do that at the very beginning, and we start to plant those seeds in our students' heads, and it seems to make a big difference in terms of them finding focus and being engaged and finding their work to have more purpose, a direction.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think there's talk about the dignity of work too. That there's a lot of value in working, and we've had some issues in the past with a fall off in the workforce participation rate. But if we can create some of these pathways to apprenticeships and make it easier to enter the workforce, that can have a host of carry-on effects, where people feel that they're doing important work, they're more engaged, they're more part of their community. if they're active.
Yep, absolutely. I think that's very true. And find more value and worth in their contribution. Yeah. And I get caught up sometimes in these notions that everyone has to pursue a STEM degree. And I'm a big fan of STEM, and I believe the predictions that we're going to see lots of growth in those areas. But not everybody wants to be a computer engineer. And when you have somebody come and rebuild your second story on your house, or when you need your car fixed, or you need something else, a tree moved in your yard, all of these things, you want that person to be good at that. You want that person to take that work seriously. You want that person to understand the complexity of what they're doing and take pride in what they do. And the way we currently sort of stigmatize and devalue that sort of work, I think is going to lead to a really a dangerous end. In the society that we have now, we all can't be computer engineers. And even, I think the reality of it too, I believe this is true, you go down to Amazon, not everybody that works at Amazon is a computer engineer. There are people that work in human relations. There are people that work in marketing. There are people that work in the business office. There are people that work on the legal side of it. There's a spectrum of things. And I'd really, not to get too evangelical about it, but I also, I want to live in a society where people can learn and pursue careers in dance or theater or music. If somebody wants to be a chef, I want them to be able to pursue that and be able to enjoy that line of work and have that work have value out in our society. And I think by this, what I think is kind of a singular and myopic notion that the only way that, forget about all of that stuff, the only way that you can move through high school successfully and move into a career is by having a 4-year degree, I think limits people's ability to be able to think about what they want to do with their lives and be able to pursue it. And certainly that has to be attached to what are the market projections for jobs. We also can't, everybody can't be a chef. Everybody can't be a software designer. But we need to think about that balance in providing options for people to be able to both discover and pursue their interests and passions, but then see how that best aligns with career opportunities that are out there. And then kids can make choices about what they want to do. Do they value earning a lot of money and living in a fancy place, or do they more value their freedom and ability to travel and do different things like that? So right now, I think the pendulum has swung a little bit too far in the other direction, and I think it needs to come back a little bit.
Well, I want to remind our viewers that you can send in your questions to us, and we'll work them into the conversation here. But we have a comment from Claudia about this is an important topic, not only in the U.S., but also in Latin America. And I'm wondering if you've seen things that other countries have done in this sort of space that the U.S. Might be able to learn from?
I think so. The tricky part for me, and again, I'm really starting to go out on the limb here, and I don't want to get too Marxist on you, Dustin, but I think, the tricky part is that when we look at examples outside the United States, there are some great examples of things we can do, but we have an interesting political and economic structure in our country that makes it fundamentally difficult for us to pursue some of those sorts of societal ambitions, I think. We're in a very competitive environment here in the United States, I think, in terms of people currently see value in a lot of material sorts of things, and we tend to idealize those folks regardless of how they've earned it. We tend to idealize those folks that make a lot of money and are terribly rich, and we see that on the internet all the time. We see that on, not to mention any names, but we see that on reality TV an awful lot and that sort of thing. And so there's a competitive environment that's bred here that I think makes people pursue and value those sorts of things that makes it difficult for us to think about the way people in other countries might go about doing some of those things. That said, that's not true of everybody. Certainly not us, right? But I think there are lessons to be learned from lots of places outside the United States in terms of how they do that. I know some of the Western European countries, in terms of the way that they run apprenticeships and that sort of thing, Switzerland, Germany, Finland, a lot of those places have wonderful systems and wonderful pathways for students to be able to pursue careers in large pharmaceutical companies or working for Mercedes or BMW, and those apprenticeships are valued and are not just the place where students who are not college bound go. They are coveted, and they're excellent, and they lead to careers that are well paid and seem to be very satisfying for those students. But I think the big difference there, again, leads us back to this notion of what we value as a society, and those tend to be careers that don't have the opportunity to do this, to become this. They tend to have this kind of a trajectory to them. And in America, we tend not to be as excited about those sorts of options.
Mm-hmm. So switching gears a little bit here.
You want to get me away from that, Dustin?
No, that's...
I understand. I appreciate it.
Well, in the issue of Research That Matters that your essay appeared in, the focus of the issue is educational justice. Mm. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about when it comes to college prep, career and technical education. If we get better at creating more pathways for a broader range of students to pursue, what are some of the long-term impacts that we might have, particularly thinking about creating more justice in our educational systems and the type of education that we're able to offer young people?
Yeah, I think more options are going to lead to more possibilities of students finding those things that they're good at, that they enjoy, and that can lead to careers that are satisfying. And there's dump trucks full of data that says that if you're happy in your job, that tends to lead to happiness in other parts of your life. And if your career is a mess, it tends to be a struggle for you in lots of other areas, housing and healthcare and those sorts of things. So I think that's fantastic. And again, I'm going to continue to advocate for us thinking about and exploring all sorts of different ways to think about that happening and creating that for students, and not relying on the traditional systems to try and provide those things. But how can we really think in an entrepreneurial way, in a outside the box sort of way, to try and create those pathways for students that don't just necessarily lead to the same outcomes, but that create all sorts of different possibilities for those students.
Mm-hmm. So right now, the way that our school systems operate, the wealthiest parents, the well-educated families tend to have the largest voices in school decisions, and they regularly expect their kids to go to college. So in thinking about that, are there one or two things that you see that we could do to maybe try and change the status quo in how the decision-making process works and get better at this?
Wow, that's a big question. Yes, I think a part of that is embedded in again this Nick Hanauer article about income inequality. I think he touched on a number of really important challenges we face in terms of representation and how that's currently doled out in our country. The interesting challenge, I think, in education, and this is something that eventually you come around to having to acquiesce to, I think, is that our systems of public education really sort of mirror the imbalances that we see outside. Education is really not that different than healthcare or criminal justice systems, in that there's sort of different levels of quality that you see, and the people that tend to get better healthcare or better representation in the legal system tend to be those same sorts of folks that get better outcomes in schools. And so I don't know that it's fair necessarily to put an expectation on schools that they're going to be a change agent in that. I think we believe they can be, but I don't know that there's much that schools could do. This isn't a very uplifting way to end, is it? I don't know that there's a tremendous amount that schools can do to try and eradicate that. And I think by putting that pressure on schools to try and do that, or holding schools up to that expectation, I don't know if that's fair. I don't know if there's enough money or enough educational reform, or we can train teachers well enough to be able to sort of mitigate or circumvent the inequalities that exist as soon as kids leave the schoolroom door. I think those things are going to be there. I think as soon as, one of the things we haven't talked about, but I think is true as well, as you're going to see, unfortunately, I think the economic theory would tell us that you're going to see a devaluation in a college degree as soon as you pump all sorts of people out into the marketplace that have a college degree, and the system is going to find a way to differentiate and sort people once they get out there. That's just going to happen. That's the competitive sort of American marketplace that we're in. And so I think it's difficult to think about trying to change schools in a way that is going to change the fundamental way in which our society moves. Perhaps, on my best days, I might think that we could start to focus less on advanced calculus and maybe more on helping students develop some of those self-awareness skills, or an interest in other people, or in community building, and those sorts of things, and that might lead to some of those sorts of changes in the system. And I think in this sort of Deweyan kind of notion of what vocational education can be, in that kids would work in community with one another, and they would start to appreciate both their work within that group and the work of others in the total. I think those are some of the promises that CTE holds. But again, that's balanced up against, if my kid doesn't get into the 4-year school and your kid does, then I've lost out, and my kid's opportunity and his future is in jeopardy. And so we're battling up against those two sorts of epistemologies.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe we can end with something that you're excited to be taking a look at, and see some program or just something that you're excited in this area.
End on a positive note. Okay, let's see. Yes. I think one of the things that I'm particularly excited about is the fact that we're starting to see the introduction of CTE, the new CTE, that's really not just your and my father's CTE, or voc ed, but now is including sort of a balance of academic preparation with professional and vocational training. I think we're starting to see kids find new opportunities to be able to explore what options are out there for them, and they're starting to find a belief in themselves and their future that holds promise for them. And so they're starting to see that the work that they can do out in the world is appreciated by those that they're engaged with, that they believe that that could lead to a life of reasonable economic stability and career satisfaction. And that is, I think, a really positive outcome for CTE as it moves forward. I think that's at the center of what this is really doing, and that for me, I think is really encouraging, because what I'd really like to see is that 69% of the ninth graders that, as I said in the article, that start ninth grade that aren't predicted to get a post-secondary degree, if we can start to build and encourage a hope in those folks, and they start to get engaged and it lights a fire under them, I think we're really off to the races then in terms of what the potential is, and that will really snowball in terms of opportunities for them out there. We'll start to really see that increase.
Great. Well, Tom, thank you very much for your time today. Thank you to all of our viewers who joined us. If you'd like to read Tom's essay or more articles from the most recent edition of Research That Matters, you can go to education.uw.edu/RTM. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And thank you for joining us today.